Welcome, Rupert. It's a pleasure to have you here in Buenos Aires and in our program too. We are very happy to have you here with us.
I'm very happy to be here, yes.
Okay. Could you just tell us and tell for the public, how did you start your love for nature and your work and your studies, and just give you a small description?
I became interested in biology as young as I can remember. When I was a child, I kept a lot of pets, a dog, some pigeons, budgerigars, tortoise, turtles, caterpillars, a rabbit. I had many different pets. My mother put up with this, and my father actually liked it because he was a keen biologist. And so I started with a real interest in animals and plants. I used to collect plants as well. Again, my father helped me. And so I knew from an early time I really wanted to be a biologist. I wanted to work with animals and plants. So I did biology at school and then at university. But there was a strange conflict arose because I really liked animals. That's why I did it. And then the first thing we did in the laboratories at school was to kill the animals and then cut them up. And then in biochemistry, which I did at Cambridge, you kill them, cut them up, and then you grind up the bits. And then you, in a test tube, you get enzymes and DNA and things. It seemed very remote from the living animals. And yet the whole fashion in biology is to look at enzymes and DNA and molecules. I was good at this. I spent years doing this, looking at molecular aspects of life. But all the time I was aware that there was something disappearing. The life itself disappears. As soon as you kill the animal, the very thing you're interested in, the life of the animal, has gone. And so I was all the time trying to find how can we understand more about life, not about the molecules inside living things, but about life itself. There's not much in modern biology that deals with life itself, and so I was working on developmental biology in plants, how the plants grow, how they take up their form, how a seed grows into a tree. You start with a very small thing which doesn't have much form. As it grows, more and more form appears, the leaves, the shoots, the flowers, the fruits, and the roots. All of these develop forms that were not there before. And this is the problem of morphogenesis, the coming into being of form. So this was the problem that intrigued me and on which I worked for many years at Cambridge. But I felt that the attempt to explain it all in terms of molecules was never going to succeed. We could find out a lot more detail. I myself found out many more details. And my colleagues are still finding out more and more details, which enzymes are made at what time, which genes are switched on and switched off. But it still leaves the problem of form unexplained. So that's why I got interested in the idea of morphogenetic fields. This is an idea already established in biology since 1920 of fields, invisible fields that shape living organisms. And I came to see that biology really needs a field theory, just as physics has field theories. We have plenty of fields in physics, electromagnetic fields, gravitational fields, quantum fields, many kinds of fields in quantum theory. And yet, biology still seemed to me to be trying to reduce the phenomena of life to the physics of the 19th century. So I felt that we really need a broader science of life. My own personal experiences convinced me of this too. As I got interested in the nature of consciousness, I did various forms of Indian meditation when I was in my 20s, and got interested in altered states of consciousness. Again, there was nothing in the biochemistry of the brain that seemed to explain these things, and nothing in the kind of science I did that even talked about them. So I became convinced that science as we know it is very important. It has found out many things, but it's much too narrow. And this is really what set me looking for a broader kind of science. I still want there to be a science which we can test by experiment and use scientific methods. But I felt all the time it was constricted in some narrow straitjacket of dogma. And so this meant that I began to explore more widely through friends, through conversations, through reading, through exploration. And this was going on while I was doing research at Cambridge. I came to the point where I thought science, I must try and find a broader kind of science. I didn't want to go on doing biochemistry. Then I went to India, where I worked in an agricultural institute. I thought if I can't do something really interesting within science, at least I'll try and do something useful within institutional science. And there I was working on crops for poor farmers and in the tropical, the semi-arid tropics, not just in India but in Africa. And that was fascinating work, very interesting applied research. I loved working in the fields. I loved working with whole plants. I liked working with village farmers. All my work was outdoors. So I loved that, and I traveled a lot in Asia. All the time I was continuing to think about a broader framework for life. And I finally got to the point where I thought I could write about it. I had a coherent idea. And so I wrote my first book, A New Science of Life, when I was still living in India. And after that I came back to England, and I've been developing these ideas ever since. But it took me a long time, you see, to find a way that could still be scientific, that could still involve experiments and proper research. But it took a long time to see that there could be a broader kind of science. And as I was exploring, I found that there were many other people also looking for a broader kind of science. I was not alone in this quest. No. Now I realize there are many people doing this, and there's a long tradition of people trying to broaden out our scientific view of the world.
How interesting, because it's like you started with the study of the tiny parts, or the minimal parts, and you took a broader vision and you tried to explain how the systems work.
Yes.
No, you have a theory of the morphic resonance. Could you explain us a little bit how it works, or how?
I'll try to explain it. The starting point for me was the development of form in plants and animals. The problem in understanding form is that you start from the fertilized egg, which has very little structure. It's a round ball with, of course, some structure within it, but it doesn't have all the organs you see in a mature animal. But scientists used to think in the 18th century that there was actually a miniature animal inside the egg, and that just inflated like a blow-up giraffe inside a giraffe egg, and so on. Well, obviously that theory is untenable. When people looked for these miniature animals, they couldn't see them. New forms appear that weren't there before. In science, we're used to thinking of the causes equaling the effects. That's why physics is based on equations. So much matter and momentum before a change equals the same amount of matter and momentum after the change. It's because the cause and the effect are equal that you can have equations equaling the amount. But in the development of form, there's no equation. You can't say this amount of DNA and this amount of egg equals a fully grown giraffe. It doesn't. There's far more form comes into being than was there before. The technical name for this is epigénesis, the development of form that wasn't there before. And all animal and plant growth involves epigénesis, the formation of new structures. So how do we explain the appearance of these new structures? What gives rise to the plan, the shape of the developing organism? And this is where the idea in 1920 of morphogenetic fields came in. The idea was there are invisible fields that give a shape to the developing organism, that act as a kind of invisible mold or blueprint. As the organism develops, these fields shape it and guide the developing structures towards the final form of the animal or plant. There's a hierarchy of fields. There's a field for the whole organism, but then there are fields for the different organs, like the arm and the leg, and there are fields for the different kinds of cells within them and tissues. So there's a whole nested hierarchy of fields. All of nature is made of structures within structures. Within atoms we have subatomic particles, within molecules atoms, within crystals molecules, within cells organelles, and then the cells are in tissues and organs, in organisms, and organisms are in societies and ecosystems. This is the holistic view of nature, that everything is made up of layers, levels. And what I'm proposing is that each of these layers or levels has a kind of field that organizes it. Each layer, each level, in each level, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And what makes it more than the sum of the parts is this organizing field. Well, these ideas were already present in biology, and I was very interested by them. They seemed to me much more helpful than the attempt to try and explain everything in terms of switching on and off genes. Of course, genes are important, but all they do is make the proteins, the building materials. What the gene theory does is explains how you get the right materials in the right cells at the right time. But that's like saying that you can understand the architecture of a building by the delivery of bricks and cement to the building site at the right time. That doesn't explain how the building takes up the shape it does, how the form is there. And many of our organs, the arm and the leg, for example, have the same building materials, the same DNA, the same proteins, yet they have different shapes. Just as different buildings can have different shapes depending on the plan, even with the same materials. That is true also in the organism. So the morphogenetic fields are the fields that shape the developing form. And they develop, the fields themselves evolve.
The fields evolve.
Yes.
But I want to make a question to fully understand what you're saying. I interpret by what you say that the information of the development of the form is in the field.
Yes.
It's an invisible field.
That's right.
There was an experiment done by Burr in 1922 that took a photograph of a Kirlian photograph of an egg of. Have you heard that experiment?
Yes. There's. You see, some of the fields living.
Is
everyone agrees
related?
that Harold Saxon Burr, who was at Yale, was a pioneer in this idea of biological fields. But Burr thought the fields were electromagnetic. Certainly, all living organisms have electromagnetic fields. I mean, all structures with electrical charge have these fields. There's no doubt at all that everyone agrees there are some fields associated with living things. All our nerves have electrical impulses. All of those, as they travel, set up fields. So all our cells have electrical charges over the membranes, and they have fields around them. So Burr thought that the fields that shaped living things, he thought the morphogenetic fields were electromagnetic. And he showed that when an organism changes, the electromagnetic fields change. But I don't think that that electromagnetic fields can explain morphogenesis. If the organism changes, the field will certainly change around it. But I think the electromagnetic fields change because the organism is changing, not in the way they're causing it. I don't think it's enough to have the electromagnetic fields. I think there's another kind that goes beyond that. And the reason for thinking morphogenetic fields organize living things, one reason for thinking it is the phenomena of regeneration. If development occurred like a machine, just one part interacting with another, then if you took away some of the parts, the organism would be incomplete. If you cut a computer in half, all you get is a broken computer. But if you cut a flatworm in half, each half can grow into a new flatworm. If you cut little bits out of a willow tree, each little bit can grow into a new tree. Now, there's nothing in the machine world that has that capacity to regenerate. There's nothing that has the wholeness in it, even if you make it into little parts. So the only things in the natural world that have this property of wholeness, even if you cut them up, are things that are to do with fields. If you cut a magnet into little bits, each bit of the magnet is a complete magnet with a complete field. And you can't slice bits out of the field, you have a complete field. And a hologram, the metaphor on which your whole series is based, is a field interference pattern, and you can take a bit away and still the wholeness remains. But these are field phenomena. So the idea of morphogenetic fields was there's a field around the living things. You cut up the flatworm into two bits, and instead of having each with half a field, each part now has a complete field of the whole flatworm, and that complete field enables the flatworm to regenerate. So there's an intrinsically holistic property in fields,
Interesting.
which is reflected in organisms through these phenomena of regeneration. We have less capacity to regenerate than most animals, but still we can regenerate liver, we regenerate skin if we cut ourselves. Our blood is continually regenerated, our skin and our hair are continually being regenerated. So this is a fundamental property of living things, and it's completely unlike any machine system. No machines can regenerate, they all have to be mended. That's why engineers and mechanics always have jobs everywhere, because machines are always breaking down and have to be mended.
One question, Rupert. Why does humans have less capacity to regenerate than, for example, as you say, other small animals or...
Well, it's not just humans. Most mammals have less capacity to regenerate. And it's not clear, you see, exactly why. Worms can regenerate. Plants usually have a tremendous regenerative power. And if you look at the amphibia, frogs and newts, even in the amphibia there's a difference. If you cut the leg off a newt, it will grow a new leg. If you cut the leg off a frog, it won't grow a new leg. But these are animals of the same biological level, and for some reason one can do it, the other can't. But if you pass a little electric current through the stump of the frog's leg, then it can regenerate. The capacity to regenerate is there, but somehow something blocks this. I think that when an organ is lost, the field still remains, but for some reason in the case of the frog, something inhibits the regeneration. I think this is one of the interesting areas for research with people. If you cut an arm off a person or a leg, and this happens very often with amputations, people who've lost an arm or a leg still feel the arm or the leg there. I think what they're feeling is the field of the missing arm or leg. I think that the phantom limb is actually the field of the missing limb. The conventional medical theory says that it's actually all inside the brain and it's just an illusion. But I think actually the field that the people with phantom limbs feel is where it seems to be. I think this is one of the areas I propose for research on human morphic fields, because a person with a phantom arm can move it around, they can put it in different places, and you can say, here is the field of the missing arm, and then you can investigate the possible properties of the field.
Well, that's been proved by Kirlian photography, no? That if you cut a piece of a leaf and you take the photo, the field still remains as if it was the entire leaf.
Yes, the Kirlian photograph experiments have been done with leaves. No one, as far as I know, has done them with phantom limbs. And this is a possible area for research. Does the phantom limb interact with the electromagnetic field? In the Kirlian photograph, it's an interaction between the field of the leaf and the electromagnetic field. So these morphic fields, you see, underlie regeneration. So I started, you see, with this idea of morphogenesis. How do forms grow? How do fields, how are they involved in the growth of form? Many biologists think that we need morphogenetic fields to explain how morphogenesis happens. The trouble is that nobody knows what the fields are. So if we explain growth in terms of morphogenetic fields, then this is explaining the obscure by the more obscure, unless we can actually explain the fields. And some of my colleagues in biology say, well, these fields don't really exist, it's just a useful name to give to processes we don't understand, conventional chemical and physical processes. That's probably the majority view. Then there are some biologists who are usually mathematicians who've converted to being biologists, and they think that if anything exists, it must be mathematical. As mathematicians always think that, well, most of them think mathematics is more real than nature, that somehow there's a world of mathematical truth which is reflected in the physical world. So they think the job is to find equations to describe these fields. I think equations are useful, these mathematical structures are useful models. I personally am not a Platonist. I don't think that mathematics is more real than the world we live in, although many mathematicians do. One of the problems with this mathematical Platonic approach is that Platonic forms don't evolve. Eternal mathematical structures are eternal, they don't change. Yet living organisms do, they evolve. This is the most fundamental feature of biology, that it evolves, that life evolves. So if these fields govern living things, since the living things themselves evolve, the fields must evolve too. So how could a field evolve? We're not used to the idea of fields evolving in physics. Most people assume that electromagnetic fields have always been the same, or gravitational fields. Although now, in superstring theory, in the most advanced regions of modern physics, people are at last speaking about the evolution of the fields of nature. But physicists would expect this evolution of fields to happen in the first few microseconds of the history of the universe, and after that they stay more or less the same. But nevertheless, they're admitting the principle that fields evolve, which is important because it's beginning to put physics onto an evolutionary basis. Anyway, if these biological fields evolve, then how would the history be within the field? And this is the key part of my hypothesis, that the fields have a memory within them. I think that the fields of a jaguar, for example, depend on the actual form of previous jaguars, that each member of a species draws on the memory of those that have gone before. The fields contain a kind of collective memory. It's as if the forms of all previous jaguars are sort of superimposed in the morphic field of a new jaguar. Since all previous animals are slightly different, the field is given by a probability distribution, not a sharply defined jaguar outline, but it's like a probability structure. And this is what quantum fields are in quantum physics. They're probability structures. I think these fields are rather like quantum fields. They're structures of probability that influence what will happen in the developing organism by altering the probabilities of chaotic or otherwise indeterminate processes. At every level in nature there's a spontaneity and a freedom which is not fully determined, and the morphic fields working from the next level above restrict the possibilities. They make one thing happen rather than another, and they work by modifying probabilities. So I think the fields have a probabilistic, they have an inherent memory, and therefore they evolve. And the process whereby a jaguar relates to the forms of previous jaguars I call morphic resonance, the influence of similar things on subsequent similar things across space and time. So the morphic fields within and around an organism take up their shape depending on what's happened in similar organisms in the past. Morphic resonance is a non-local connection. It involves a connection through space or time where the information, the pattern moves, but not energy. It doesn't involve a transfer of energy, but of information, of form.
Sorry, it's just between the species?
It's usually, the basis is similarity. So the more similar, the stronger the influence. So in the case of mammals, for example, all of them are similar when they're very little, although embryonic mammals are very similar. We're not very different from a rat or a dog when we're very small. I think at that level, probably all mammal morphic resonance in the early embryo, there's a big influence from many different species, and as the embryo develops it becomes more different and it becomes more specific, the resonance. And the resonance is always from the most similar things in the past. So the greatest resonance working on all of us will be from past members of our own family, from those who are most similar to us. In the case of dogs, as they develop, a Labrador would be mostly influenced by Labradors, and it would tend to have the behavior of Labradors, and a sheepdog of sheepdogs, and because they're more similar. But there would still be a more general resonance from all other dogs, so there would be a general dog characteristic with more specific influence of the particular breed. So, and among human beings, the ones that are most similar are identical twins. So I would think you get most morphic resonance between identical twins. If they're separated at birth and live in different countries, still their great genetic similarity and their similarity of environment in the womb would mean they resonate very strongly with each other. And I think that's why we often find identical twins one may have particular mannerisms, take up a particular job, marry a woman with a particular name even. And many studies on identical twins, mainly at the University of Minnesota in the United States, have shown extraordinary similarities between their development. Usually this is interpreted to say, well, all this must be genetically programmed. But I don't think that's what's happening. I think most of it is because they resonate with each other most specifically. So morphic resonance is based on similarity. And in the case of development, this is related to genetic similarity. Genes, of course, play a part in all this, but it's as if the genes create the components of the television set. If you have a television set, you have to have the material structure of the set. You have to have the right transistors and wires and condensers and all that for the set to work. The genes give rise to the material structures. But the pictures you see on the screen of the television set, for example, as people see us on the screen, if they didn't know anything about television, they might think that small versions of us, that we were actually inside the set.
Claro.
But we're not inside the set. We can tell everyone that definitely. We're not inside your television set. We're somewhere else. We're in Buenos Aires. And so the influence, the invisible influence, is coming into the television set from outside through a field. And this is then appearing on the screen. If you change the material components, the picture will change. Take out a condenser or resistance from the tuning circuit and they may get some other channel. If you change another one and the picture may lose its color. These would be like mutations where genes change in living organisms. They can affect the form, they can affect what happens, but it doesn't prove it's all coming from inside the television set. You see, I think the mistake in contemporary biology is to assume it's all arising from inside, that everything must be explained by the genes and the proteins that are in the material structure of the organism, whereas in fact a great deal of what's happening depends on invisible influences coming from outside, from other organisms, through morphic resonance. That's why I think we need these invisible fields to help explain organisms and influences by morphic resonance from other places and other times. Otherwise it's like you could spend years trying to understand a TV set, just analyzing copper wires and analyzing. You could spend many years and you'd never understand how it really works. And I think that's what modern molecular biology is doing. There's plenty of work to keep people going. There's so many enzymes, so many DNA sequences. There's enough work here to keep people going for decades. They'll all be busy, they can publish papers, there'll be conferences and more discoveries and so on, patenting genes. But it will never lead to an understanding because it's not all inside the organism. The influences are coming from outside as well. So I think that's why we need to have both the fields and the genes to understand heredity, and why the understanding of life has to involve more than just the structures inside the organism. I've spoken mainly about the development of form, but the same principles apply to the evolution of behavior, because the nervous system is very indeterminate, and I think that there are patterns of activity imposed on the brain through these fields which control, and they work on the brain. The brain's like an instrument that these fields can play on. It's a very crude analogy. It's like a piano on which the fields play. You can have a piano, it can play many different sounds, but the pattern of movements depends on the music that's being played, and that's not contained inside the piano. If it's a jazz pianist, in his own mind, he can make up these things as he goes along. And you'd never find the pattern of the music by analyzing the strings of the piano.
That's a fabulous point, I believe, because it questions, it's that like the information coming from outside, no? And that's all a great difference. No?
That's a big difference from the usual view, which would always say it's coming from inside the brain or inside the genes. So the whole of our modern biology is based on the idea it's all inside. But we now have so many technologies, so many metaphors, which can show us it's not all inside. The whole modern world is based on electromagnetic technologies. Every room that we're in, every space we're in, is full of invisible influences coming from mobile telephones, radio transmissions, TV transmissions, and so on. there's this huge amount of invisible information. 100 years ago, this was inconceivable. Now, it's part of everyday life. Every child knows that there's invisible information everywhere. We take it for granted. And it's a strange thing, you see, that the main ideas within mechanistic biology were formed in the 19th century. In fact, the machine theory of life was developed in the 17th century by René Descartes. And in a sense, this is locked into a conceptual framework, which is no longer appropriate. It's based on a kind of old-fashioned materialism that only the matter inside the organism is important, leaving out of account the fact that non-local fields, invisible connections, are actually the way that most of nature, even according to modern physics, works. And so I think that in biology too, a lot of the information in the organism is coming from outside, not just from inside.
Yeah, very interesting. And how do you think, because it's the information outside, that it's like what you said, the morphic resonance between the species, then between a particular, for example, the example you said on dogs from Labradors, but then a larger one that's between dogs, no? And then there should be surely a large one, no? That keeps perhaps living like animals, no?
Yes.
And there should be a larger. How does this expand, or how do you see it?
Well, I think, as you said, there would be the most specific resonance working on a Labrador would be from its own immediate ancestors, then from all other Labradors, and then a more general one from other dogs, then from the dog genus, which would include wolves and foxes, and there are other species within the genus and the family, and then from mammals, and then from all vertebrates. In the embryology of animals, we see these affinities. We see when we grow as embryos, we pass through a stage where we have gill slits like little fish. And this is like a memory of our ancestral, our ancestors were fish, along if you go back far enough, and before that worms. So some of this is reflected even in our embryology, not an exact recapitulation of the adult forms, but we share something in common with the embryonic forms. There's a kind of memory going back hundreds of millions of years reflected in each of our own developments. And I think that's because the resonance starts more general and becomes more specific as we develop. In the case of plants, it's the same thing. With a variety of rose or of peach, you have the specific variety, and then you have the whole, the rest of the general species form, and then the genus, the family. It's more, there's a general background. A similar idea is present already in the psychologist Jung's idea on the collective unconscious. He says that each of us draws on a collective human memory and in turn contributes to it. This is very much the same as I'm saying. I think that in our behavior, in our mental activity, we also pick up things through morphic resonance. And Jung thought that the main influence acting on us would be from our own family, then from people from the same culture and the same racial group, because we have more in common, hereditary common factors, and also cultural, with the same language group, the same culture. And then remote tribes in Africa or Australia who we don't have much direct contact with, no hereditary connection. There'd still be an influence from all of humanity, but the most specific influences would be those of people of the same family, culture, similar genetic background, and then a more general influence. So there's something common to all humanity that influences us, but against that common background, then there are more specific influences.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit or explain us how the theory of Caotic attractor, how it works, how things are like tend to I don't have the word, evolucionar.
They evolve towards an attractor.
A higher level.
Well, the idea of attractors is part of modern dynamics. It's a form of mathematics used for modeling systems in the real world. Chaotic attractors are just one kind of attractor. They're the attractors that are used in chaos theory. But it's part of a more general concept of attractors. And I can illustrate it by a simple analogy. You see, old-style mathematics was based on working out what would happen if you push something from behind. So you push a billiard ball, you can work out which direction it will go, then it will collide with something and that will happen. If you work out causes from behind, then it can become very complicated. There are many systems in nature where it's easier to work the other way round, to work with where things will end up instead of where they start from. Say you have a big bowl, just like a pudding bowl that used in the kitchen. You can throw a little ball into the bowl. Every time you throw a ball in, it could be a different angle, different speed. And if you calculated for every ball, you'd have to do a lot of calculations for each ball that you threw in with the exact speed, exact momentum. You could calculate what would happen. But what happens is that all these balls, wherever you throw them in, whatever speed, they roll around and they'll end up at the bottom of the bowl. That's the attractor. So if you have a mathematical system that says, here's the attractor, anything that comes into this basin of attraction will end up there. We can model all these systems not by many, many different calculations from each thing. We'll model them where they're going to end up. Then you have a different kind of mathematics that works according to the basin of attraction, it's called, the space in which these things will move and the end towards which they'll go. Now, one kind of attractor is where in a pudding basin they end up in the same place. They just come to rest. That's the simplest kind. Then there's another kind of attractor, a periodic attractor, where they settle down into a cycle. And that would be like a pendulum. If you have a stone on the end of a string, you can throw it in any angle, but it will settle down until it's ending up in a cycle. Then a chaotic attractor is more complicated. Instead of settling down into a simple repetitive cycle, it settles down into something which is much more varied. It doesn't ever come to rest or come into a simple cycle, but it comes into an attractor which has some order, some structure, but nevertheless is not a simple period or a simple resting point, and that would be a chaotic attractor.
It's like a random movement.
Well, it looks random, but actually it has an order behind the randomness. And when people are modeling morphic fields, the morphic fields are include morphogenetic fields, the fields of development, behavioral fields, the fields of behavior, mental fields, the fields of mental activity, social fields, the fields of social groups. Every system has its own kind of field because it has its own kind of wholeness. The generic name for them is morphic fields, of which morphogenetic fields are one species. They're the developmental fields. The way that people model morphic fields mathematically is in terms of attractors. Usually, when an organism is developing, it doesn't reach an equilibrium. An embryo doesn't stay an embryo. It is trying to move towards an adult form. So there's, like, the adult form is the attractor that attracts the developing organism. The adult form of a tree is the attractor which shapes the growth of the seedling. And if you cut a bit off a seedling, the thing will regenerate until it can reach the same adult form of the tree. Even if you stop it doing it in the normal way, it will still get there because it's drawn towards a goal. This is again like if you think of the pudding basin analogy. If you put a barrier there so the ball hits the barrier, and if it will bounce off it, it would follow a different course from usual, but it would still end up at the same place at the bottom. Because what's happening is that it's being pulled towards an attractor. Now, some people, like Fritjof Capra, would say we shouldn't speak in terms of it being pulled towards an attractor. Yet the mathematical modeling and the use of the word attractor implies this movement towards an end or a goal. And I think, in fact, it's through the concept of attractors that mathematicians have reinvented the idea of goal-directed behavior, which is a key feature of all biological processes. All organisms seem to behave as if they're heading towards goals. The developmental goal of reaching the adult form, the behavioral goal of an animal reaching food, a predator capturing prey. These are purposive, goal-directed behaviors, not necessarily with a conscious purpose, but they certainly have attractors or ends towards which they're moving.
Perfect. I mean, that's like humans or adult forms of a determinate species, or if we go we a little bigger scale, and we say where the human species, to where is it supposedly evolving, or the planet, where is it supposedly evolving or going?
Well, that's a slightly different question. You see, there's two kinds of ways we can think of attractors. Within most of biology, every time a cat grows, a kitten grows into a cat, it's reaching the mature form of the cat, and that cat will have certain instinctive behaviors, like chasing small things that run around, like mice or toys or bits of string. These instincts are present generation after generation. For each individual cat, for each individual kitten, there's an attractor of the mature form and the mature behavior, and reproducing and having kittens themselves. So these are repetitive attractors. I would say that the goal of an animal or plant, it lies in the future for that individual, but because of morphic resonance, it's a kind of memory of what's happened before. It's like a cycle. The future goal for a child as it grows up is a kind of memory of mature form that already has happened many times before. For plants and animals, the goal lies in the future, but it's actually a memory from the past as well. Now, most of nature is repetitive. Most species reproduce their form, and many species do so for millions of years.
Over and over again.
Over and over again. Living fossils, like Limulus, which is the horseshoe crab, or Equisetum, the horsetail plant, these species have not changed very much for about 100 million years or more. They're called living fossils. So in these cases, the repetition goes on over and over and over again through billions of generations. Now, most of nature is repetitive. That's why we can predict so many things, and why the course of nature is habitual. I say it's repetitive and habitual because of morphic resonance, which is like a memory. In fact, I would say that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits, that nature is essentially a system of habits. There's a memory in nature which gives rise to habits. But evolution means that some things change, even though most things are habitual. There's an onward movement, a change in the course of life, from a time when there were only bacteria, then the time when there were dinosaurs in the Jurassic, and then to the age of the mammals and so on. There have been many changes in the history of life. So in the course of evolution, as well as habit, there's also creativity. New things can happen. Not all new things that happen are successful. Only the successful ones survive. And this is Darwin's principle of natural selection. So the question is there an overall purpose in evolution? Now, this is although an individual animal may have a purpose, which is to repeat the goal of its ancestors, it's another question as to whether all of evolution has a purpose, and if so, what it is. It's very easy for human beings to think that the purpose of evolution is to generate human beings, but maybe the dinosaurs thought the purpose of evolution was to create dinosaurs. Well, maybe it was. We have no reason to think we're the end product of evolution, or that the modern world system and economic system is the ultimate goal of 15 billion years of cosmic evolution. It's easy for us to delude ourselves that we are the ultimate goal, but it may not be so. And one of the problems with any simple anthropocentric vision of cosmic purpose is, if the purpose of the universe is for us to come into existence, why does it need billions of galaxies for this to happen? Why do we need such a vast universe? With even when we look at the sky at night, every star we see in the sky is in our own galaxy, and yet beyond it there are billions of other galaxies. And if the evolution of life has as its purpose the creation of human beings, then why do we need millions of species of beetles and other insects? There seems to be in life the production of diversity. The evolutionary process seems to have an ability to produce a fantastic diversity of living forms. And the idea that we're the only goal, you see, or even that life on this earth is the only goal, is perhaps too narrow a view. There are people who think that maybe the key feature of evolution is the development of consciousness. That may be so. But then, if the development of human consciousness is the purpose of it, then what about the rest of the universe? There are those who think there may be other forms of life in the universe, but at present the scientific attempts to detect them seem to me hopelessly naive. I mean, on the one hand, there's the heavy engineering approach, spaceships, which can't really get much further than Mars or other parts of our solar system. And then there's the attempt to beam out on powerful radio transmitters the series of prime numbers or the decimal places of pi or other mathematical constants, assuming that distant civilizations on other star systems will pick up these faint signals and then beam back other mathematical formulae. Well, you see, this method has severe limitations. Our galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So even to communicate within our galaxy, it would take 100,000 years for these mathematical formulae to reach a star the other side of the galaxy. And even if they replied by return of post, it would take another 100,000 years for the reply to come back. And so if we ask some mathematical question and a faint answer comes back 200,000 years later, who would remember the question? So it seems to me that if the evolution of human consciousness has any cosmic significance, not even in terms of our own galaxy, these conventional methods of transfer of information are just not very plausible. Even if we could establish radio contact with other stars and other planets in other star systems, we're talking about enormous periods of time to transmit simple messages. I think that if human consciousness has any cosmic significance, the connections we'll have with other forms of consciousness in the universe are not going to happen through this kind of technology. I think they're going to happen through direct conscious contact. And this is, after all, what mystics have talked about throughout all the centuries, the idea that through the mind itself, it's possible to make contact with higher forms of consciousness, wherever they're located, maybe in other dimensions, maybe in different star systems. There may be many forms of consciousness in the universe, but the only way we're going to be able to contact them, I think, is through direct, something a bit like telepathy, through some direct mental contact, not through sending huge rockets into space, which will never get very far, nor yet through these radio transmissions of mathematical constants.
Okay, well, Rupert, thanks a lot for all the concepts you've brought us, and thanks a lot for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.